Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I would like to welcome you to the fourth installment of the Novus Law Firm and Fortney Scott's Back to School webinar on higher education post-COVID-19 legal and compliance concerns. This briefing will be recorded. I want to address some preliminary items before we start today's briefing. Currently, all listeners' phones are muted. At any point in time during the presentation, please feel free to submit a question in the GoToWebinar question box. We will try to answer all questions. Today's webinar is a discussion of best practices for OFCCP compliance and what to expect if your institution is subject to a compliance review. The presenters include attorney Natasha Baker from the Novus Law Firm and Fortney Scott attorneys Elizabeth Bradley and David Fortney. I will now turn the program over to David Fortney to start our webinar.
Well, actually, Natasha, I'm going to let you kick off today, okay?
Sure. Great.
Okay.
Great.
Perfect.
Thanks, everyone, for attending. Welcome back to our fourth segment here. So we are going to talk about OFCC compliance, not strictly COVID related, but one more challenging legal development that has happened while our institutions are struggling with COVID. So just wanted to make sure that you're aware of some of the new obligations and concerns that we're seeing here. If we could click to the next slide, I will take us through the agenda and make sure that we cover this important legal notice. So this presentation is not legal advice. You should consult with your campus counsel, outside counsel, particularly for OFCC compliance. Very technical, not something you want to guess at. So make sure you are consulting with someone who really understands OFCC compliance in order to make sure you're meeting your institutional obligations. So I'll take us through the agenda and then we will kick off. We're going to do a high-level overview of all the things that we think you need to know in terms of focusing on OFCCP compliance. We are going to mention the new executive order as it pertains to diversity, equity, and inclusivity training. There's some substantial overlap by those who are covered by OFCCP compliance and those who are covered by that executive order. We're not going to spend a lot of time on it because that could be a whole separate webinar, and we probably will do something on that, but we would be remiss in not mentioning it at this point. So we're going to cover sort of really understanding some of the new audit lists that have come up, the institutions that are appearing on there, and how that plays out across the regions under the OFCCP, and really understanding how the differences can make a difference there. And then we're going to cover whether you're actually covered by OFCCP. This is a question that comes up all the time in higher education. We're going to give you some factors to look at to make sure you understand what types of contracts are covered, and so you can take that back and assess your need for OFCCP compliance. And then Liz is going to take us through an AAP structure, an affirmative action program structure, whether you need single or multiples. And then we will take you through what to expect in an audit by OFCCP. So a lot of big topics there. We're just going to stay high level and just make sure that we understand sort of what's happening. And if you've got further questions, throw them in the chat or feel free to follow up with any of us. With that, I welcome you. I encourage you to submit any questions, and I'll turn it over to David just to say a few words about the new executive order.
I'm happy to, Natasha. Thank you, and it's great once again to be with you and Liz both, albeit virtually, but that's become our the new normal for all of us. So here we go. Well, let's talk a little bit about this new executive order. It's an executive order entitled "Combating Race and Sex Stereotyping." Let me give you the rule from Washington: the more benign or positive something sounds, the more dangerous and troubling it often is. That's an old rule of thumb, and this executive order lives up to those expectations. The executive order was issued on September 22nd, and it focuses on diversity and inclusion training. But it's not, although it contains certain provisions that say that is supportive of diversity and inclusion training, it actually seeks to impose a number of restrictions and on what types of training can occur, or more specifically, cannot occur. And it makes it clear that for both federal contractors and grantees, that there now are these new restrictions, and according to the Labor Department, some of these requirements are effective immediately. That is as of September 22nd. So let's just briefly introduce some of those concepts that are a little bit new in this executive order. The executive order prohibits what it calls divisive concepts, and that definition is given for you on the slide. It also talks specifically about race or sex stereotyping or scapegoating.
Mm-hmm.
What becomes clear when you dive and unpack the executive order, that what they're really talking about is training that focuses on topics such as white privilege, implicit bias, and other concepts that candidly have become extremely common and popular in current DE&I trainings. And that is even more so in response to the Black Lives Matter and the social movements that I know every university and higher ed institution on this call is actively concerned on, focusing on, and to a person, I'm confident, has revisited and likely amped up and expanded your training. That's certainly been our experience. So this is one of the most fundamental points. The training that has expanded to respond to the social changes and to all the key stakeholder interests, some of that training, some of the core training on implicit bias is now potentially prohibited, or at least according to this executive order is prohibited, based on Title VII discrimination concepts. And the underlying issue, and then Liz, I'll let you jump in here in a second, but one of the underlying issues is, according to the President's executive order, such training such as white guilt or implicit bias, the executive order finds that that is potentially unlawful discrimination for whites. It is directed at protecting the interest of all interest groups, but it is clear that this executive order is very targeted on protecting white interests and those individuals who feel the training may make them feel, that is whites, feel uncomfortable in the training that's being received and discussed.
Agreed. And what I think a takeaway from this is what do you do right now? And everybody needs to be taking a close look at your existing training decks. What's out there? What's publicly available? What are you rolling out? So again, we're not here giving you necessarily legal advice. You need to be talking to your in-house counsel or external counsel about what you do with your current training programs.
One other point I'd like to raise before we jump off this, there recently in the last 3 days, has been some fairly highly publicized initiation of reviews and audits directed at Microsoft and Wells Fargo. So although the new mechanism under this executive order relies on complaints being filed with the Labor Department, and then they would investigate those complaints. In this instance, these two examples, Wells Fargo and Microsoft, it is the Labor Department who has reached out and has said, in essence, we reviewed your website. We reviewed the statements you have made. We believe that the statements you put on your website may constitute unlawful discrimination, statements addressing implicit bias. Candidly, that's quite disturbing and chilling to a number of us because of the issues it raises. Well, and this is a very current developing situation, so we don't have all the detail. What we do know is that those two contractors have received those letters. We understand, although there's the possibility that more letters may come out, that no additional letters have yet issued, and that the Labor Department has been largely directed on following through on these issues through the White House and through some of the policy leadership in the White House. So, and it's interesting, this executive order actually was raised in the presidential debate, or I guess that was a debate between President Trump and Vice President Biden of a week ago. And you saw Vice President Pence surfacing these topics himself. So these are key, they're part of the active policy political debate in the presidential contest. They have been now fed down into the contractor community, and the Labor Department, including potential enforcement actions, have started within the last week.
Yeah. And I think one of the be mindful of, and we're often working with clients who want to set very aggressive D&I goals, and you need to be thinking about what is the underlying basis for those goals. Are you going to be able to achieve those goals? You want to be very careful here that you're not setting yourselves up for a goal you can't achieve, which will then ping them for concerns about reverse discrimination allegations. And that's what some of this is being focused at as well.
What I would suggest on this, if folks have a particular interest in this, this is something that we are really following closely and going to be doing some pull-up meetings probably within the next week to provide more detailed briefings, because this is almost an add-on for today. Just ping us back at info@fortneyscott.com. That's an email to info @fortneyscott.com. And we'll get you in the mix, and we can deal with this in a little more detail. But this is a very important, very surprising development that candidly, no one saw was coming. Okay.
Yeah,
and
I think that on the other side of that, David, you mentioned there might be some other developments coming that will impact institutions of higher education. So we will be sure to keep you up to date over the next few weeks as these things roll out. But we do, from what I understand, anticipate a few more updates to come that would cover federal contractors.
Absolutely.
Correct. So people will get this deck. It will provide you, this is lifted right off the executive order, so you get a sense as to what's divisive. I just would point out item B on this slide. This is the unconscious bias. This is the list of what you shall not do. It's like the 7 dirty words that George Carlin used to say, that the FCC said, you shall not say these words. An individual by virtue of race, sex is inherently racist, sexist, oppressive, whether consciously or unconsciously. That is a prohibited diversity and inclusion training topic underneath this new executive order. So, as well as a number of others, as you can see from the list there. Okay.
So, and on the next slide, just real quick, circling us back to a little bit of the OSC compliance, and this is in much too much detail for the scope of where we wanted to stay today, but also in that executive order are some additional OCCP compliance pieces that go into effect towards the end of November. So the training's there, but there's additional flow down and notice requirements. So you need to be looking at the executive order for those housekeeping and procedural requirements under the 11246 as well.
Right. But the immediate, I think the takeaway for today is you need to look at your current diversity, equity, and inclusion trainings, whether you do it directly or whether you have a vendor or contractor coming in and doing it for you. And there's a lot more detailed guidance on that. And that is something where, to Natasha's point at the top, you should have counsel help you on that to make sure to figure out whether these newly announced boundaries, whether you are in bounds or out of bounds on those trainings. Okay.
So moving on, OFCCP audits are coming. Are you
More
ready?
Good news. More good news.
I know. I love that. Yeah, David passed it to me.
We'll just give a disclaimer. This is generally a downbeat presentation, okay? We don't have good news.
So OFCCP are coming. If you want the next slide, we have OFCCP on September 11th posted their corporate scheduling announcement list. What this is it's a list, and there's a service and supply list, which is what would apply to higher ed. There's also a construction list out there. And these lists include everybody who the agency is going to be auditing in their next, the goal is to open them within the next fiscal year. So you will be audited if you're on this list. When you're going to actually get the scheduling letter, we don't know yet. So the CSAL is a heads up. It doesn't trigger the start of your audit. They still have to mail you out the actual official scheduling letter. And that scheduling letter, when you receive it, triggers, hey, you're going to be audited. But what you should be doing is, here's the CSAL list is on the FOIA library. There's a link to it. Pull it up. see if you are on that, if your organization, your university is on there. And if you are, be looking at the address. What information does the agency have about your entity so that you know where it's going to be mailed to? Because you don't want the scheduling, you have a heads up. They're going to be not very friendly with asking much of an extension to do your desk audit, pause COVID related reasons. So they're giving some COVID extensions, but they really say you should be prepared when you get the scheduling letter. So make sure whoever's addressed on there knows to be looking for it and knows to forward it to the appropriate people promptly, because that starts the clock running of when you need to do your submissions. So the next slide, oh, go ahead, Natasha.
Yeah, I want to echo Liz's statement that in our experience, the federal agencies generally right now are really not amenable to any sort of extensions, moving a deadline. They are under enormous internal pressure to get things done for obvious political reasons. So even agencies that used to be a little bit friendlier in terms of understanding why you might need more time to gather information, we're finding are not at all right now.
Right.
Liz?
Yes, David. Yes.
Raise my hand.
Courtney in the corner.
I just got, there's a message in the chat box. I just want to circle back before we get too far away. There was a question of the executive order, and this is one point I think we should clarify. And the question is, are the restrictions on trainings for the employees, the diversity restrictions? The answer is yes. What about students? Can there still be teaching of students? And interestingly, the executive order expressly addresses that nothing in the order prohibits, as part of a larger course of academic instruction, the discussion of these topics. So we have a out of bounds for diversity training, but it does not impinge into, I'll call it academic freedom in terms of what the school instruction encompasses. And I thank the questioner for that, and I think that's helpful for everyone to know that.
I do think there's a caveat into that. You got to make sure the academic instruction is somewhat neutral, right? You're instructing on it, but can't be advocating in one way or the other. I think that is some of the language in there, so you got to be.
Those are finer points, right?
Yeah, I know, but same. So this next slide just gives you a visual of how to find the CSAL lists. They're not always, the OFCCP's website isn't always the friendliest thing to navigate. So I Google OFCC FOIA library, and this page will come up, and you'll see it's in the fiscal year 2020 CSAL service and supply down there towards the bottom. Also on this slide, and we're going to talk about conciliation agreements a little bit later. David's going to talk about those with regard to compensation. This is also the page where you can pull up every conciliation agreement that we're going to be talking about later today is also available on this page. Conciliation agreements are sorted by fiscal year, by if they have a financial versus a non-financial remedy. So it's all there. I think it goes back to 2013, I believe, but they're out there for you. So moving on and to get some level setting in this and to understand some of the differences that we see in the way audits are processed, I'm going to turn it back over to David to give us kind of an overview of the OFCCP leadership and its structure.
Okay, and I'll do this very quickly just so we have a sense. Let's jump to the next slide, please. The head, the title is the director. That's the head of the agency. This is not a Senate confirmed. It is a political appointment, but not Senate confirmed. The head is director is Craig Lean. Craig's from Florida. You can see his bio there. I think of particular interest, he was an adjunct professor at the Florida International University Law School, and was there when then Dean of the Law School, Alex Acosta, former Secretary of Labor, was there. So that is kind of the connection and how Lean got in. But Lean does have experience and background as an employment lawyer, worked with Morgan Lewis, and where he did gain significant experience, and also had some public sector experience in the city of Coral Gables down in Miami. Very nice guy, very, very affable, very outgoing, very approachable, and in particular, very focused in particular on disability issues personally. And it's very open about the fact that he has members of his family who have significant disabilities and talks about that very frequently and is a very strong advocate for civil rights and for that. So some of these initiatives we're talking about today, I want to remind people, are not necessarily ones that he personally dreamt up, but he is the messenger and is carrying forward. So let's go forward and talk a little bit briefly. And I think this is particularly important as we look at it. The OFC, in our experience, tends to work in little fiefdoms. A lot of agencies do. So if you look at each one of those regions as being its own, somewhat siloed, it's gotten a little better, but not really always. But you will look and see, and so it makes it a little challenging because we do know from our experience that the ways compensation gets looked at in one region may be different, or in one, how hiring's looked at. I mean, there are all sorts of differences that roll out in audits. Also, you will notice when we talk about the results for higher ed, almost all of them, they've been kind of disproportionately focused on the eastern part of the country, and that what they call the Northeast, Mid-Atlantic, and Southeast audits. In the Pacific region, perhaps best known for very aggressive auditing of the technology sector, very conversant and familiar on technology jobs, which of course all of you have a lot of in your structures, and to a lesser degree the financial sector. But those, I'll just pause for a moment there, and I just would note, if you get one of these audits or an investigation under this new executive order, it makes a difference which region and which office, because there is a lot of variability.
Yeah, and I think that's important for higher ed because, you know, a lot of presentations are often national, the listservs are national, so we see people trying to compare, well, what happened, or what were you able to negotiate, or, you know, what was your compensation modeling? And because they're so siloed, it seems in this particular area that you really want to be talking to people in your region about how your region handles things, has been my impression.
Yep, but I would take that to hearing what's going on in your region, but sharing cross regions, because it is one agency, and it's often powerful to go, especially Director Lean wants transparency, he wants consistency. You know, one of the things he heard when he came in is that it was, you know, 5 different agencies actually, depending. So we've had success in going back to the agency and saying, well, I know you're saying this in this audit, but in this audit over here in this region, you did it differently. You can't have something be a violation in this region that's not a violation in that region. So kind of helping corral the agency is sometimes beneficial.
Correct. All right. Well, let's talk a little bit then on the next slide.
Yeah, so David, I think this question is for you. This comes up all the time in higher education of who is exactly covered by OFCCP? Right. Do we have to comply with these things? I know it comes up for us probably a couple times a month at least, so I want to make sure people are getting clear answers on who is actually covered, what kinds of federal funds trigger coverage, particularly in higher ed.
Sure, be happy to. So let's dive right into that. So obviously, in my experience, literally every higher education institution that we have dealt with receives federal funds. But how you receive the funds, what the funds are, what the delivery mechanism is, makes a difference. And this is where we need to get a little bit in the weeds, but this is important to sort out. And indeed, it's always one of our threshold questions. When OFCCP starts an audit, are we in fact sure that we're a contractor? That is the question. So you start with, to trigger OFCCP obligations, you have to have what's called a federal contract, in this case for supplies and services. Typically what universities are doing are services. They may be a variety of services, research, etc. The terms are provided for you, the regs are provided there, but the contracts at issue are ones that, I mean, typical ones could include research contracts, other types of contracts that are very common. The funding mechanism, that is student loans, that type of thing, that is not the contracts that we're talking about here. It is a contract in which the university typically has a direct contract with a federal agency, one of the defense agencies, or it could be any number of agencies, but there's a direct contract with it for services that the university is to provide. Let me just pause on that point. Natasha, anything that you want to dip in on that?
Yeah, and I think we can just really make sure that people understand that distinction, because as I said, there are just so many different sources of federal funding that really we're looking for research services pursuant to a federal grant, really, or excuse me, federal contract, really digging in on what the source of that funding is. And even in that Freudian slip right there, I think I just
well, but which sets up nicely. Let's talk about grant, because this is what makes a difference. It is just federal funds. We've talked about contracts. That triggers the OFCCP enforced EEO obligations, affirmative action obligations, everything that we're going to spend most of today talking about. But also there's a lot of money that comes into higher ed institutions through grants. So next slide, please. There it is. Okay. Do grants trigger coverage? Generally, the answer is no. Okay, so this is why it is so important, and we've given you the citation as to the reasons why, because a grant is just that. It is where money is given for a purpose. It's not a contract for procuring services from the university. It's a research grant, is a very typical example. So for purposes of generally for the obligations for affirmative action plans, for responding to OFCCP regular audits on that CSAL list that Liz walked us through, contracts. Grants do not trigger that. However, we want to point out that last bullet on the slide, that new executive order, putting the restrictions on diversity, equity, and inclusion trainings, that applies to both contracts and grants. It is very broad. It is broader than just the typical OFCCP enforced obligations. So the general rule is you got to have a contract to have OFCCP coverage and enforcement. The one exception is this new executive order on DE&I training. Okay, good. Well, but that's an important question. And anyone that deals with OFCCP always asks these questions. Are we in fact covered? Now, what about Medicare? Medicaid, because many institutions, of course, have healthcare facilities in which Medicare and Medicaid is a provision. Does that constitute a contract for services? Believe it or not, that issue has been an open issue for over 10 years. It has been litigated. It has been rulemaking. It's been legislated. It's been it's been a real hot potato. And what happened was, a number of institutions said, you know what, if you are going to impose all those OFCCP enforced obligations on me, I'm not going to take any more Medicare, Medicaid. I'm not going to take that. I'm not going to take on the patients that have that because I don't want to trigger all these additional obligations. The government finally said, okay, that's not a result that we like. We don't want people being denied healthcare because they're afraid of OFCCP coverage. So it's one of the few times where the Labor Department actually relented and said, okay, never mind, we will not impose all the OFCCP burden and obligation, and you are free to take Medicare and Medicaid. That does not constitute a contract that triggers coverage and obligations. And it really came up in the context of veterans particularly. There were literally hundreds of institutions that were saying, we won't take care of it. We would love to take care of veterans, but we just don't want all those Labor Department obligations. It literally was, if you get rid of the Labor Department obligations, we'll take care of the patients. And that's finally, ultimately, with a level of certainty, we can tell you what has occurred. So we've talked about contracts, we've talked about grants, and there is a carve out for Medicare and Medicaid, and here it is for you. Okay.
So thank you, super helpful. And we would say that as people are doing some homework, takeaways from this website, you just really want to get clear in your mind. There are many different statutory schemes that address consideration of protected categories of race, sex, age, and you need to get clear in your minds which ones apply to you on the basis of, are you a contractor, are you a grantee, Are you a recipient of federal funds? You know, there are different competing schemes that all institutions need to look at and have a clear understanding of what your legal obligations are. But the definitions don't overlap, because that would make it too easy.
That'd be too easy. And so let me just add one other point, because more often than not, a contract isn't university wide. It's for the engineering school, or it's for, you know, whatever your particular situation will be. So then, of course, the question comes up, well, okay, we appear to have a contract. How far does that obligation extend? Can we limit it to the component of the higher ed institution to which the contract was entered into, the engineering school in my example? The general answer is no. Generally, if you have a contract with one component of the university or the college, the result is that the entire institution is subject to the Labor Department obligations. The legal test involves whether it's a single entity. There are ways to get carve-outs or exceptions. Those have to be approved by the agency. But generally, a single contract with one component of your higher ed institution typically results in the entire organization being subject to these obligations.
And generally, the only way we usually see if a university has a contract that sometimes if the hospital, if an attached hospital has a contract and there's some different corporate structure between the health system of the university and the actual university itself, they often meet they're separate entities and can be divided. But generally speaking, when we see the School of Engineering having a contract, it's going to then cover the School of, you know, of Sciences and the other. It's going to cover the rest of the academic school.
This is something we've seen as it feels like a gotcha, and that's why we want to make sure that everyone understands this. You have to sort of not just look for contracts in the university's name, you have to really delve down in through your procurement functions to get to the bottom of whether you do or don't have these contracts. All right, let's go to the next topic.
So Liz, I think you're now going to tell us, if you're subject, what do we do?
Right. So developing your AP, and I believe David said I have 2 hours for this section earlier.
This is Liz's passion project, so we are going to limit her.
I'm on a short leash. So moving to the next slide. So what we're thinking about here is, if you're covered, what is the scope of your AAP? How big is it? Is it your entire institution? And what does that mean? Is it you have multiple campuses, every single campus in one AAP, or is each campus their own AAP? Or can you do AAPs based on smaller buildings or within each of your campuses? If you've looked for guidance on this and you are seeing conflicting information, you are right. There is not a clear message on this. And so I always start with the law. It's where the regs, which is what is enforceable and what a violation can be based on. So the regs are perfectly unclear in the fact that they require that you do a written affirmative action plan for each establishment. And everything is based on an AAP for your establishment. And it has to be the establishment in which your employees work. So let's flip through the regs and look at the definition of establishment. It's not there. There is no definition of a regulatory definition of an establishment. So what OFCCP has adopted, it's here on the next slide, is they've adopted a definition from EEO1 reporting requirements. Not applicable to higher ed. You file, go back one, sorry. Go back to the prior slide. Great, thank you. So because their regs don't define establishment, they've adopted the EEO1 definition, which is here on the slide in front of you. And what OFCCP has also done, understanding that their regs don't truly fit on to higher ed well, they published the Higher Educational Technical Assistance Guide. We call that the TAG. And in that technical assistance guide, the goal of the guide was to provide sort of a bridge between the regs and how to apply those and interpret those into the higher ed context, and to provide some best practices on compliance. how to comply with these regs in the higher ed context. And what was interesting though, and they did provide there's some great information in the tag. So if you have not looked at it, definitely go to OFCC's website, pull up the technical assistance guide. It has some wonderful information in it, but it still doesn't get to the bottom of, do you do a single AAP or multiple? So they provide this definition of establishment that's completely irrelevant and not helpful to higher ed. But then on the next slide, they did clarify that higher ed institutions, educational institutions may develop multiple or single AAPs. Great. Okay, so they're looking at that establishment requirement. And they give you some recommendations, and they say contractors with campus-like settings may have multiple buildings or schools that each constitute an establishment. Great. So that's telling you you can do each school as a separate AAP. And it has a list of factors that they recommend that you look at. And those factors are on the next slide. Sorry. And this is, again, it's showing you these are recommended factors you look at. It gives you this roadmap to walk through and say, what makes sense in my environment? Do I want this campus? Do I want my entire university? Or do I want to go to the School of Engineering? We're picking on the School of Engineering today, but the School of Engineering is going to be its own plan, because employment decisions, really, the dean is it. Well, there's oversight on the provost, but the buck really stops with the dean, and they make the hiring decisions, and comp is based on that because of the demands in that area. And there's all kinds of things you can think about that what makes most sense in your environment. So good, we're getting some guidance and we're getting some ideas here. Remember though, the tag is sub-regulatory, so you can choose to follow these, or you can go back to the more generic definition of an establishment and go down that road. So then out comes the CSAL list and attached FAQs. And on the next slide, oh, I'm sorry, I skipped. Well, sorry, I jumped forward because I know I'm trying to be quick, David. One of the things I'm sorry, Val, if you could go back a second.
Boy, we really put the fear of 10 minutes into you on this one.
I know. Sorry. So within the tag, they also clarify, and a couple things to look at here is it says academic institution house with a campus with a medical school, a law school, and other schools and departments that operate distinctly with the, and then they give some factors, could be a separate AAP. So this is, again, great information, great guidance that we're looking at. Now we can go to the next slide, Valerie, sorry. Oh, but wait, the FAQ for what to expect in an audit. University reviews will include the entire university campus located in one city. Now, then it does go on and say that possibly the medical school's out or it's hospital, but what happened to the law school that was able to be out in the last example? The other schools, the departments. So the OFCCP's own internal guidance is not giving us any sort of clear direction on how to develop your AAPs. So with all that said, the confusion is real. The lack of guidance is real. If you choose to do individual AAPs, I do not see them able to actually issue a violation. They're going to try. David and I have just lived this with a university that was going through an audit. We finally resolved it by agreeing to give a couple more of their establishments. But what you need to be thinking about at the bottom line, end of the day, your AAP needs to be a tool that you use proactively. What groupings make sense to you, to your organization, so that you can look at what happened last year and say, I have underutilization in this area, and I need to do better outreach and recruitment. And I'm not seeing women being promoted, minorities being promoted at a certain rate, or I'm looking at my termination numbers and women and minorities have chosen to leave. The AAP needs to be a tool for you to help address problems. overly broad AAP, I think, is going to be, it masks problems and it gives false indicators while not showing you the real areas of concern. So you need to look at your campus and develop your AAPs in a way that you can use as a tool. So when the agency asks you, why is it done this way? You can say, it's because I want to make progress to goals. I want to use this as a proactive tool. So, know that you can be flexible and just make your AAPs mirror your personnel practices and decisions. And notably, they can be very different. How you prepare your faculty may be very different than your staff. So for example, in your School of Engineering, the dean may drive everything with regard to faculty, and you may have an engineering school faculty, it's headquartered where your dean sits. But if the support staff are more driven from a different, if they're centralized, you may have them. And there's ways you can think about how to properly structure based on where people are housed and based on the regs. So talk to your council, but you can make sure that that your APs fit. So that is my spiel on your AAPs. David or Natasha, anything on that?
I just have one point, which is some people may say, what do I care? I mean, this all sounds very interesting, but why ultimately do I care? And isn't it cheaper if I just have one AAP? Maybe I just have one and I'm done, one and done. Well, I just want to underscore Liz's point. The AAP should model how your actual personnel selections and decisions, and including compensation, hiring, promotion, are made. And particularly in universities that have, in higher ed institutions that have very diverse range of workers and decisions and compensation decisions. Normally, if you put all that together into this big university-wide stew, it isn't terribly accurate. And you will get people, because different departments are paid differently, their market value is different. There's many factors that come into this. And therefore, we think that it presents not only a false picture, but our experience has been the agency will tend to find that there are differences that are not unlawful differences, but because they're simply in different study areas, different disciplines, different types of jobs that have been improperly combined and compared. And therefore, this can make a real difference. This isn't just a wonky point. This has a very practical point when you are looking down the barrel of an audit.
Well, and to that point, David, it makes it very difficult when you put everybody in one AAP, especially depending on how you do your job groups, and we can spend a day on that topic. But then at the end, if you're in an audit and the agency is looking at your compensation for a group for a moment, and you say, well, but they're not really similar. You've got it. There's like, you grouped them together. You put them together for your AAP. They were familiar, you have an obligation here. They were similar enough for you to analyze them together. Kind of hard for us to now retro and pull them out of that grouping and defend. So that's we see that often, where not a lot of thought is put into who's in these groups at the front end. We just throw it in, and then so yes, you might have saved money by doing one AAP in the front end. You're going to spend a lot more money on the back end, either curing an issue that you didn't know was there, right, or litigating out of one that's not really there.
And this really bridges nicely into what you do expect in an audit. And Natasha, why don't you jump into that?
Yeah, Liz, I was going to say, you and I have spent a lot of time talking about how really the OCCP regulations weren't drafted contemplating higher ed and how higher ed operates and is decentralized and doesn't have neat job categories that are, consistent across the organization. And so in addition to sort of understanding how to define your establishment or whether you want separate AAPs, another thing to really understand is the type of information you need to provide during the course of an audit. And this can really help underscore that it's not just, these regulations were built for very consistent manufacturing, or, things where the job categories were very different. So one of the things I know, Liz, you've talked a lot about was sort of the collection of promotion data generally, and how that.
think about this, right? And Natasha, I want to ping it back to you, but this is the generic language the OSCCP put out there. So that's why we wanted to put it. We know it doesn't fit this audience, and that's the point, right? We wanted to show you that they're asking for these records. One thing, and because of time is short, and I think the most problematic population that this is going to go to is faculty. They want copies of personnel files. They're also going to be looking at, they're very interested in tenure because they're looking at that glass ceiling. They want to know where minorities and women aren't getting above. So why are they not getting tenure? So Natasha, let's think about this. In advance, you have to give them data that shows the pool of potential promotions and who is actually promoted. And in their mind, and it is, being granted tenure is a promotion. How are you going to define that pool knowing that you've had to put all of your employees into these job groups that have nothing to do with their qualifications for status and progress to getting tenure?
Yeah, Liz, I agree. It's super complicated because those job classifications don't fit nicely. I mean, in any given academic year, you can know who's up for promotion and tenure. Their names have been submitted to the appropriate faculty body. Where we've seen a lot of difficulty is where are those personnel files? There are personnel files in HR, there are department files, the Office of Academic Affairs may have promotion files, the committee itself may have promotion data. So it's not a clean pull. You don't just go to HR and pull the file and say, here's our promotion information. That information is literally decentralized, kept everywhere. A lot of it is hopefully within the purview of the committee. The committee may not be aware of their obligations to share this during an OFCCP audit. So just first of all, part of it is the logistics of like, where is this information? And then second, I would say in higher ed, the expectation is that information, the department chair's letter, the colleagues' letters, those things, those have all been submitted with an expectation of extreme confidentiality. Now we know they're not confidential if they're subject to a subpoena in litigation, but I think a lot of people would be surprised to hear how much of that promotion, the tenure file, is available and submitted to the OFCCP during the course of an audit. So
Yes.
Just being able to gather all of that information, quickly review it I won't say it's a nightmare, but it's
recently
difficult.
had an audit, and it was pre-COVID because there was an on-site, which was an actual on-site.
On-site.
Remember when you saw each other in person? And so we fought on this exact point, and I'll say the agency was very confused, and they wanted to allege that we had a record-keeping violation because they had asked for the records for it was a short list, but a list of specific faculty members. And they came in and they were given different boxes. And fortunately, it was an on-site, so we pushed back on actually turning it all over. So they did a physical on-site review and just posted a few documents they wanted copies of. So that was, but they didn't understand. We had to educate the agency about why this box has this type of materials and walk them through. And they really thought we needed to, as a best practice recommendation, they were going to put that we had to combine all these records into a central location. So it is going to be a burdensome thing to be thinking about how to report this data when doing your AAPs.
Yeah, and just remembering that data is all over the place. I mean, it's literally held in like 4 or 5 different departments. You see that in litigation, but this has such a broader scope for the request. Mm-hmm. And then I think the other just area that we've seen, and Liz, you and I have talked about, is gathering the information related to accommodations and yes, making sure that is produced appropriately. So on the next slide, we look at sort of what the agency might be looking for in terms of both religious and disability accommodations, those policies and procedures. But the second bullet, the documentation of accommodation requests and dispositions, in my anecdotal experience in employment in higher education, is not rigorously maintained. Student requests may go to your Section 504 coordinator. It's hit or miss on whether your employee requests go to your Section 504 coordinator. But oftentimes these are really done at a localized level. There's not enough documentation. I mean, if you were to really say, can we obtain all of our accommodation requests, I would be suspicious that you've got a proper method for tracking those internally. Maybe you do, but anecdotally, I think that's a real area to focus on to make sure that is clean.
as a
Exactly what I
practical
was gonna-
matter. Oh, go
Right,
ahead,
I mean,
Liz.
before I know where you're going to go. To hold up real quick, David, on that piece, but on those records that we're talking about also, to the extent we do have them and you pull them from the different schools or whoever is holding those, the agency is going to look, have you been consistent in granting or denying, and why is one person denied? So not only if the records exist, they're decentralized, which also means the decision-making process has been decentralized. And if you have granted the request and not for somebody else, is it a race or gender issue? That's going to raise issues. So the being able to obtain the records as well as consistent determinations is going to be really important going forward, and the agency is really looking at this. I'm sorry, David. Oh, Natasha.
No.
Which takes us to we had the second webinar. Like, we talked about administering COVID requests and administering ADA accommodation requests centrally. And, you know, we've been talking about accommodation requests should be centralized for years, but especially with the advent of COVID, it should be centralized. And that's the exact point there, Liz, that you brought up in that second webinar about you have to be consistent. If two people have very similar accommodation requests, those should be handled similarly from the vantage point of the institution, not the particular rotating department chair who happens to grant it or not. So it's a huge issue.
Alcohol treatment, standard record keeping, and I will say in the context of OFCCP, if you're not able to produce those records, as has been discussed here, largely you just don't get credit for it. I mean, we have had the situations where client doesn't have records, so we have the local managers and, well, you know, when they asked, yeah, I made this accommodation, I did this, I did that. And frankly, that has been discounted a good bit. I mean, to the point that we actually had to bring the individual forward to say, yes, they did grant my accommodation. Then the agency was willing to say, oh, okay, I guess you did. I mean, it's ridiculous. So this is a best practice for a lot of points. It's COVID, it helps you on ADA, and it helps you making sure that from the institution standpoint that the accommodations you want to ensure being made are in fact being extended uniformly, consistently throughout. Yep. So, yeah. It's not that hard to do. I mean, with the softwares that are available, you know, you can have a shared document. There are lots of ways of doing that. So,
yeah. So that takes us nicely to our next area of consistency, or lack thereof, as David's going to explain. But looking at how the compensation analysis is conducted, and then some lessons from recent conciliation agreements.
Okay, I'll be happy to kick this discussion off. So let's jump to the next slide. So in the last year, there have been a number of published resolutions with different higher ed institutions. Most of them, as we indicated, happen to be on the eastern side of the country. That happens to be where most of the audit activity has been. That's not going to continue to be the case, though. But there are some lessons learned, and now we're going to go back to some of the themes we talked about before. Not all the resolutions are consistent. There are different models out there, and the agency varies a little bit. So here, excuse me, is one for the University of Virginia. This is in that what they call Mid-Atlantic region from 2019. Most settlements, by the way, you'll find occur in August and September of the calendar year, because that corresponds with the end of the fiscal year for the federal government, and OFC wants to get things wrapped up. So here we have one from August, happens to be 2019. This is important because it provides a very detailed roadmap of how compensation can be assessed on a school by school basis. And I would have to say that this model right here represents what, in our experience, we often find when we go to colleges and universities. There is variability between schools for a whole host of reasons, different disciplines, different market value, different so many things, all of which we believe is legitimate, lawful, and supportable, but and the real test as to whether that school is working appropriately is looking at it on a school basis. This settlement, University of Virginia, this is a public document, back to that FOIA reading room that Liz identified for you, so this isn't secret stuff, it is all there. This represents a set of factors that the OFCCP has agreed is a legitimate way to group and look at your compensation okay, in order to determine whether there is potential unlawful disparities that exist. Let me just pause there. Liz, yeah.
I will say they've agreed that this is appropriate after conciliation. So, and we're going to talk about, and David's going to talk about this more. This isn't where the agency ever starts.
No.
So we have to figure out, and part of this discussion is how to get the agency here in your data so that they do the analysis right.
Right. And you'll notice one of the points that I think is very important for higher ed is tenure or tenure track or non-tenure. And left to its own devices, OFCCP in our experience tends to put it all into one bucket.
Yep.
And I feel pretty confident that everyone on this call, if we would poll you, would say, well, gosh, we pay people pretty differently depending on which track they're on, because it's the whole point. That's one of the things that you have achieved when you become tenured. There's a compensation difference, or if you're on the tenure track, among other differences. OFCCP doesn't voluntarily want to recognize those distinctions or embrace those. They're real and should be emphasized. Yes, Liz.
Yeah, and I think an issue there is educating the the agencies about universities, and we've all done it. We've been part of these conversations, but we still get the agency doesn't really understand that non-tenure track, tenure track, and tenured. We often the question, well, how long do they stay on the non-tenure track until they're promoted to tenure track?
Right.
Right, and that's not, so they don't, because the faculty, they think they're all the same. So part of it is we could spend a day on this, but how to educate the agency when you're submitting your data in a way that.
A practice tip I would offer in informal conversations with your compliance officer, candidly or otherwise, try to determine what level of formal education that individual has. And I say that respectfully because we have had compliance officers who never attended college. They may have a graduate equivalent degree. The investigator jobs at OFCCP do not require college education. So the workplace of your institution may be so different. I mean, they may have been in a poultry processing plant the other day. They may have been in a meat packing plant. They may have been in a warehouse. And and it's not that there's no value judgment. All those jobs are important, as are your jobs, but they're very different. And the way people are paid and the way people advance are different for legitimate reasons. And you must make sure you have to spend some time making sure they understand. And the concept of tenure, to Liz's point, we've run into this. They do not understand what that means more often than not. So please be sure that you spend time with them on those concepts.
So we want to touch on also Princeton here for a minute, because we made this
Princeton, because that just came out. You run that one, Liz. Go ahead.
Yes, we made this progress in 2019 with UVA to say, you gotta mirror the way we do our comp. You gotta do it properly. Well, then pretty disappointed to see this resolution come out just the other day in the Princeton review. And as this documents, the analysis is just all female, full professors. So it doesn't even distinguish for us whether that's, and we didn't represent, so I don't know, but are there full professors who are tenured, and also does this full professor ever apply to any sort of non-tenure positions? We don't know if they're crossing those. But they've put them university-wide, all full professors in one bucket and trying to analyze for them. Exactly what the agency acknowledged and agreed in UVA was not appropriate. And so, Princeton rebutted that and said that you're not modeling it appropriately, but still, this is the way the analysis came out. And so it shows that OFCCP is still starting with these overly broad buckets and not truly modeling your comp. We recently had success with a higher ed. They had put 3 of their AAPs in for a submission. And along with it, we did a detailed narrative and said, for this type of employees, you have to analyze, for our tenured, this is how you group it. And our groupings were in our data. For the non-tenured, here's what you need to do. And we gave the agency the roadmap We didn't let them start in this place. At least if they start in this place, they're expressly ignoring what you tell them going in. David, sorry.
No, that's fine. Let's jump to the next slide because we're close on time. So there have been different institutions that have recently entered into settlement agreements. The nomenclature, they're called conciliation agreements, or CAs in these practitioner slang. That's what it means. You can think of that as settlement agreement, conciliation agreement. And there's the list, and they're configured for you by OFC region. So you can see every one of these institutions, I can promise you, was well counseled, well advised. These aren't rogue outfits. They're not doing things intentionally to discriminate or treat people improperly. And yet most of these include a monetary component. They include compensation. That is what it's all about. And there are a lot of lessons learned here. Every one of these agreements is available publicly through that website that we talked about at the top, through the FOIA library.
Yeah. Key thing when you pull these, I would look at what the reporting requirements are. Multiple, they're required to do compensation analyses, and then they have to report those to the agency. So you're going to be publicly reporting comp results to the agency under each one of these conciliation agreements. So that's something to be looking at and know that is out there.
Yep. Okay.
Okay, well, that brings us to here in the Pacific time, noon hour, 3 o'clock your time. We did want to encourage anyone to submit questions either through the chat or afterwards. These slides will be made available to attendees. Really helpful presentation there, Liz and David. So wonderful in terms of understanding what institutions of higher education need to do and to expect should they be placed on that CSAL list or receive an audit as a result of a complaint. So thank you so much for that, really helpful.
And I was going to say one other thing, Natasha, we are expecting new regulations dealing with so-called religious freedom probably in the next 15 days. So perhaps we can fold that into next month's briefing and give you an update on that. But it appears that there will continue to be a lot of pretty robust developments relating to OFCCP and federal contractor obligations, certainly for the next foreseeable future.
Yes. Well, thanks everyone for joining us. I don't see any questions in the chat. I'm not sure that, do you see any?
We picked up a couple of those as they came in, so I think we've got those cleared off. Yeah.
Perfect.
Thanks everyone. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Bye.
We would like to thank you for joining us. As a reminder, you may review the previous briefing on Fortney Scott's website at www.fortneyscott.com. Everyone who registered today will be registered for all future higher education focused briefings. Be on the lookout for additional updates, which will be sent via email. Later today, you will receive a survey requesting feedback for today's presentation. You are able to submit suggestions for future topics through the survey. Thank you in advance for completing the survey, and of course, if you have any questions, you may submit them via email to info@fortneyscott.com.